On September 21st, 1931, Britain broke a promise it had kept for over 2 centuries, and in doing so, created the blueprint every government now follows when financial survival is at stake. Within 48 hours, 24 other countries followed suit. What if I told you that the most powerful financial betrayal in modern history happened not in some backroom deal, but in broad daylight, with newspapers announcing it to the world? And what if that betrayal became the template our government still uses today every time they need to escape impossible financial promises? Picture this scene. September 19th, 1931, 11. Downing Street Chancellor Philip Snowdon sits across from Bank of England. Governor Montague Norman staring at ledgers showing £21 million in gold, flowing out of Britain's vaults in just 1 week. The empire that built its wealth on the promise that every pound could be exchanged for gold is about to break that promise forever. But here's what should grab our attention. This wasn't a sudden crisis. For over 2 centuries, Britain had made the same ironclad guarantee to every person holding British pounds. Bring us your paper money and we'll give you gold at a fixed rate. No exceptions. No conditions. No matter what. That promise built the British Empire. It made London the financial capital of the world. It turned the pound sterling into the global reserve currency that everyone trusted. When you held British money, you weren't just holding paper. You were holding a piece of the most reliable promise in human history. Think about the weight of that commitment. For 200 years, through the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, and even the catastrophic spending of World War I, Britain had honored this guarantee. They had raised taxes, slashed government spending, and imposed brutal austerity on their own people, rather than break their word about gold. So, what changed in 1931? What force was so powerful that it could shatter 2 centuries of the most sacred financial promise ever made? The answer reveals everything about how our monetary system actually works today, because what happened to Britain in 1931 is happening to us right now. We're just using different words for it. Here's the timeline that changed everything. In January 1931, the Bank of England held £130 million in gold reserves. That might not sound like much today, but it represented the foundation of global financial trust. Every major bank, every government, every wealthy individual around the world knew they could convert their pounds to gold whenever they wanted. But then cracks began to show. In May 1931, Austria's largest bank, Credit Anstalt, collapsed under a mountain of bad debt. Within weeks, panic spread across Europe as investors realized that banks everywhere might be hiding similar problems. The global financial system, built on confidence and trust, suddenly faced its greatest test since the war. Here's where the gold drain became a flood. In July 1931 alone, £43 million in gold rushed out of London's vaults in just 6 weeks. Foreign banks, governments, and wealthy investors who had trusted Britain for generations were now demanding their gold back immediately. They'd seen what happened to Austrian depositors who waited too long. By September, the situation had become desperate. Bank of England, Governor Montague Norman, the man who had sworn to defend the gold standard at any cost, watched helplessly as £21 million disappeared from British vaults in a single week. That's equivalent to draining our Federal Reserve of $280 billion in 7 days. But the final trigger wasn't economic, it was political. On September 15th, sailors in the Royal Navy mutinied at Invergordon, refusing to accept government pay cuts imposed to save the gold standard. News of British military unrest sent shockwaves through global markets. If Britain couldn't maintain order in its own navy, how could it maintain the value of its currency? In the 48 hours after the Invergordon mutiny, another £10 million in gold fled the country's foreign central banks. Seeing the writing on the wall, began converting their pound reserves to gold as fast as possible. The French central bank alone demanded £30 million in gold, while smaller countries rushed to salvage whatever they could. On September 19th, that fateful meeting at Downing Street sealed Britain's fate. Chancellor Snowdon and Governor Norman stared at numbers that told an impossible story. At the current rate, Britain would be completely drained of gold within 3 weeks. They faced a choice that no British government had faced for 2 centuries. Honor their promise and watch the empire collapse, or break their word and maintain political control. They chose to break their promise. On September 21st, 1931, Britain officially abandoned the gold standard. The Currency and Banknotes Act suspended gold convertibility temporarily, though that temporary suspension has now lasted 93 years. The pound, which had traded at a fixed rate against gold since 1717, was suddenly just another piece of paper, backed only by government promises. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Within 24 hours, sterling crashed from $4.86 to $4.20, a 13% devaluation overnight. But more importantly, within 48 hours, 24 other countries followed Britain off the gold standard. The global monetary system that had provided stability for decades collapsed in less than a week. Here's what this reveals about every government's true priorities. When forced to choose between keeping promises to their people or maintaining political power, they will break the promises every time. Britain didn't abandon gold to help ordinary citizens. They abandoned it to save themselves from having to make the hard choices that honoring their commitments would have required. And here's the part that should concern every American today. The mechanism they used to escape their promises didn't disappear in 1931. It evolved. It got more sophisticated. It got harder to see, but it never went away. The promise-breaking playbook Britain created that September day is the same one our government uses today whenever they need to escape impossible financial commitments. They just don't call it abandoning the gold standard anymore. They call it quantitative easing. But here's where the story gets really interesting, and where we start to understand exactly how this promise-breaking mechanism actually works. Because what Britain discovered in 1931 wasn't just how to escape their gold commitments. They discovered something far more powerful: how to make their financial problems disappear by making everyone else's money worth less. Think about this scenario for a moment. You owe your neighbor $100, but you're broke and can't pay. Normally, you'd have to default, declare bankruptcy, or find some way to earn the money. But what if you had a magic button that could make everyone's dollars worth 30% less overnight? Suddenly, that $100 debt becomes worth only $70 in real purchasing power. You haven't defaulted, but you've essentially stolen $30 from your neighbor without them realizing it. That's exactly what currency devaluation accomplishes. And it's exactly what Britain did, starting September 21st, 1931. When governments face impossible debts, they don't default like ordinary people would. They devalue. By reducing their currency's value against other currencies and gold, they pay back creditors with cheaper money while making their exports more competitive. It's a hidden tax on savers and a subsidy to debtors, all disguised as economic necessity. Here's how the math worked in Britain's case. On September 20th, 1931, one British pound was worth $4.86. By December 1931, that same pound was worth only $3.40. That's a 30% devaluation in just 3 months. Now, let me put this in perspective with real numbers. Britain's total government debt in 1931 was approximately £7.8 billion. When they devalued the pound by 30%, they instantly reduced the real burden of that debt by £2.3 billion, without paying back a single penny. That's equivalent to making $3.1 trillion of our current national debt disappear overnight through pure monetary manipulation. But here's the truly revealing part. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't some accidental side effect of abandoning gold. The Currency and Banknotes Act of 1931 was carefully crafted to maximize the government's ability to manipulate currency values, while minimizing their legal obligations to creditors. The act did 3 crucial things. First, it suspended gold convertibility indefinitely, removing any external constraint on money creation. Second, it gave the Treasury unlimited authority to issue paper currency without gold backing. Third, it established a legal framework for what they called exchange management, which was really just a polite term for currency manipulation. Within months, Britain created the Exchange Equalization Account with £150 million specifically to intervene in foreign exchange markets. Their job wasn't to stabilize the pound's value. It was to manage its decline in a way that maximized Britain's advantage while minimizing international retaliation. And here's what should really concern us. It worked brilliantly by making their currency cheaper. Britain made their exports more competitive while reducing their debt burden. Their unemployment fell, their trade balance improved, and their government avoided the painful spending cuts that honoring their gold commitments would have required. The problem was that this success came at everyone else's expense. When Britain devalued, they made every other country's exports less competitive. They transferred wealth from foreign creditors to British debtors. They forced other nations to choose between accepting economic disadvantage or following Britain into competitive devaluation. 24 countries chose to follow Britain off the gold standard within 48 hours because they realized the game had fundamentally changed. If one major economy could escape its commitments through devaluation, everyone had to devalue or be left behind. But the devaluation mechanism didn't end in 1931. Britain used it again and again whenever they faced impossible financial choices. Each time, they refined the technique and perfected the rhetoric that made promise-breaking sound like responsible economic policy. In November 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson faced another sterling crisis, as foreign investors lost confidence in Britain's ability to maintain the pound's value at $2.80. On November 18th, Wilson announced a 14.3% devaluation, reducing the pound to $2.40 overnight. Here's the exact quote that reveals how governments think about breaking promises. Wilson told the British people that the pound in your pocket wouldn't be affected by devaluation. That was a complete lie. While the pound's domestic purchasing power remained temporarily stable, its international value had just been cut by more than 14%. Anyone who traveled abroad, bought imported goods, or held foreign investments had just been robbed of 14.3% of their wealth. But Wilson's real innovation was the language. Instead of admitting that Britain was breaking promises to foreign creditors, he framed devaluation as a necessary tool to make British industry more competitive. Instead of acknowledging wealth confiscation, he emphasized job creation and export growth. He turned promise breaking into economic patriotism. The pattern reached its peak on September 16, 1992, a day still known as Black Wednesday. The Bank of England spent £3.3 billion in a single day trying to defend the pound's value against currency speculators led by George Soros. When their reserves ran out, they had no choice but to withdraw from the European exchange rate mechanism and allow the pound to devalue by 15%. Soros earned £1 billion in profit that day by betting against the Bank of England's ability to keep their promises. But here's the crucial insight. Soros didn't force Britain to devalue. Britain's unsustainable fiscal and monetary policies forced the devaluation. Soros just recognized it first and positioned himself to profit from the inevitable promise breaking. Each of these devaluations followed the same script that Britain created in 1931. First, make promises that sound reasonable but are mathematically impossible to keep. Second, blame external forces when those promises become unsustainable. Third, break the promises through currency manipulation while claiming it's necessary for economic recovery. Fourth, use the temporary competitive advantage to postpone rather than solve the underlying fiscal problems. The legal framework for this promise breaking evolved with each crisis. The Emergency Powers Act gave governments authority to suspend normal legal protections during financial emergencies. The Exchange Control Act allowed them to restrict capital movements when people tried to protect their wealth from devaluation. The Banking Act gave central banks discretionary powers to create money and manipulate markets without parliamentary oversight. By 1992, the mechanism was so refined that governments could break major financial commitments in a matter of hours, while maintaining public support through carefully crafted messaging about economic necessity and national competitiveness. But here's what changed everything. In 1971, President Nixon closed the last link between major currencies and gold by ending dollar convertibility. Suddenly, every major government had the same promise-breaking powers that Britain had pioneered in 1931. No currency was constrained by external convertibility requirements. No government had to choose between keeping promises and maintaining political control. This is where our story moves from historical curiosity to current urgency, because the devaluation mechanism that Britain perfected over 60 years didn't disappear when currencies became fully fiat. It evolved into something far more sophisticated and much harder to see. Today's governments don't need to break the gold standard. They've replaced devaluation with money creation. Quantitative easing achieves the same wealth transfer that Britain pioneered in 1931, reducing real debt burdens through inflation while protecting asset holders who own what gets inflated. But here's the genius of the modern system: they don't have to announce it anymore. When Britain abandoned gold in 1931, newspapers around the world reported it as breaking a sacred promise. When our Federal Reserve creates $4 trillion through quantitative easing, they call it accommodative monetary policy and win Nobel Prizes for economic innovation. The mechanism works exactly the same way, just with more sophisticated language. Instead of devaluing currency against gold, central banks create new money to buy government bonds. Instead of openly reducing debt burdens, they target inflation rates that quietly erode the real value of fixed obligations. Instead of admitting wealth confiscation, they emphasize employment targets and financial stability. Let me show you how this works with real numbers that affect your daily life. In March 2020, the Bank of England created £450 billion in just 11 months for quantitative easing purchases. That's more than our entire government annual budget created out of thin air and pumped directly into financial markets. Think about what that means for your savings account, earning 0.1% interest while official inflation runs at 11%. Your money is losing purchasing power at roughly the same rate that Britain's gold standard creditors lost wealth in 1931. You're just not getting a newspaper headline announcing the theft, but the real innovation is how they've made promise-breaking look like crisis management. In September 2022, when pension funds faced potential collapse after the Trust's mini-budget, the Bank of England created £65 billion in just 3 days to prevent systemic failure. They called it emergency bond purchases. But it was really the same devaluation mechanism Britain used in 1931, creating money to escape impossible financial commitments. Here's the pattern you need to recognize. Every financial crisis since 1971 has followed the same script that Britain wrote in 1931. When governments face choices between keeping promises to creditors or maintaining political control, they choose political control every time. They just do it through monetary expansion instead of currency devaluation. The October 2023 Treasury guarantee of £100 billion for mortgage market support perfectly illustrates how this works today. When rising interest rates threatened to collapse the housing market, our government didn't let market forces determine prices. Instead, they guaranteed Bank of England lending facilities that effectively create money to keep mortgage markets functioning at artificial price levels. That's not market economics. That's the same promise-breaking mechanism that Britain used to escape gold standard obligations, just applied to housing instead of currency convertibility. Now let me show you exactly who wins and loses from this modern, promise-breaking system, because understanding this reveals everything about how wealth really flows in our economy. The winners are always the same: asset holders who own real estate, stocks, and bonds, financial institutions with first access to newly created money, and government debtors paying back loans with cheaper currency. When central banks create money, it flows first to banks and financial markets, inflating asset prices before it reaches the broader economy. If you own a house worth £300,000, quantitative easing has been very good to you. According to Office for National Statistics data, house prices have increased 450% since 2000, while wages grew only 75%. That's not economic growth. That's monetary inflation, creating wealth for asset holders at everyone else's expense. The losers are equally predictable: wage earners watching purchasing power erode, savers earning negative real returns on bank deposits, pension funds trying to meet fixed obligations with devalued currency, and young people priced out of asset markets by monetary inflation. Here's the math that reveals the true scope of this wealth transfer. UK government debt to GDP ratio increased from 35% in 2007 to 103% in 2023. Under normal circumstances, that level of debt should have triggered a borrowing crisis, similar to what Greece experienced. Instead, Bank of England quantitative easing purchases kept government borrowing costs manageable by creating money to buy the bonds that private investors wouldn't purchase at artificially low interest rates. Meanwhile, real wages fell 2.6% in 2022 to 2023, despite nominal wage growth, as money creation fueled 11% peak inflation that hit essential goods hardest. The same monetary expansion that kept government debt sustainable made ordinary people's lives more expensive. But here's what should really concern you about this system. It's designed to be permanent. Unlike the gold standard, which provided external constraints on government spending, fiat currency systems have no built-in limits on money creation. Every financial crisis provides justification for more monetary expansion. Every economic downturn requires more stimulus. Every market instability demands more central bank intervention. The Bank of England's total quantitative easing purchases now exceed £895 billion since 2009. That's money created from nothing and used to manipulate bond markets, suppress interest rates, and maintain unsustainable debt levels. It's the functional equivalent of Britain's 1931 devaluation, just spread over 14 years instead of happening overnight. And unlike historical devaluations, which eventually ended when competitive pressures forced governments to restore sound money policies, today's system faces no external constraints. Every major central bank operates under the same fiat currency framework that allows unlimited money creation. There's no gold standard to return to, no fixed exchange rate to defend, no external authority limiting monetary expansion. This is why the pattern is now permanent. Central banks can create unlimited amounts of money to purchase government debt, suppress interest rates, and bail out failing institutions without ever having to admit they're breaking promises to savers and creditors. They just call it monetary policy and claim they're managing the economy for everyone's benefit. The promise Britain broke in 1931 wasn't really about gold. It was about limiting government power over money. Every financial crisis since has followed the same script. When faced with impossible choices, governments choose to break promises to savers rather than promises to spend. The only difference now is they don't need to announce it. The devaluation mechanism has become so sophisticated and so embedded in normal economic policy that most people don't even realize it's happening. Your savings lose purchasing power gradually instead of suddenly. Asset prices inflate slowly instead of crashing. Government debt grows steadily instead of triggering immediate crisis. But the wealth transfer is exactly the same as what happened to British creditors in 1931. You're just paying for it through inflation instead of devaluation. And it's happening over years instead of months. The mechanism that Britain created to escape impossible financial promises has become the foundation of our entire monetary system. And that's why understanding this history isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential financial intelligence, because as long as governments have the power to create money without constraints, they will use that power to transfer wealth from creditors to debtors, from savers to borrowers, and from ordinary people to those with first access to newly created money. The only question is whether you'll recognize the mechanism in time to position yourself accordingly.